Welcome to the latest edition of the MBN Iran Briefing. With me today is Ken Pollack, Vice President for Policy at the Middle East Institute, author of 10 books, bestsellers, formerly of the CIA, NSC, and also he's appeared on Oprah a few times. So welcome, Ken. We have a lot to talk about whenever the topic is Iran. Certainly there is no shortage of topics. I want to kick off right from the beginning with you, Ken, and ask you about deterrence. You know, it's a word that's used a lot, deterrence. It could be deterring the Iranian regime from building nuclear weapons. It could be deterring war. I know that you've thought about and written a lot about deterrence. When does it succeed? What constitutes success? And of course, we have deterrence from both sides, right? Because we have the Iranians wanting to deter the U.S. from attacking. We have the U.S. wanting the Iranians to deter the Iranians from doing not nice things. So that's the big word in the air. And I just want to start off by asking you, we have a war that started on February 28th, and here we are. It's July. Did deterrence work?
Yeah, so I think this is a really important question. And from my perspective, one of my greatest concerns about the prosecution of the Iran war so far is that I actually think that the United States and its allies have lost deterrence with regard to Iran. Let's start here. If you had spoken to me 6 months ago and said to me, all right, there's going to be a war with Iran, do you think that the Iranians will close the Strait of Hormuz? My answer would have been almost certainly not, because Ayatollah Khamenei, this is Ali Khamenei, the previous supreme leader of Iran, has made it very, very clear that he understands that closing the Strait of Hormuz would be an enormous escalation that could easily drive the United States and all of its allies to combine forces, not only to reopen the strait, but to bring down the Iranian regime. And he's not willing to take that risk, right? And we'd seen this over and over and over again. And of course, we've been collecting information on the Iranians and planning and plotting and strategizing and wargaming. The first wargame I ever participated in about the Iranians possibly closing the Strait of Hormuz was back when I was at CIA in 1991. And trust me, the U.S. government has been doing it thousands of times ever since then. And this was very clear. We'd seen it in Iran's behavior. And the problem that we face now is that having gone ahead and tried to overthrow the regime, and let's understand, regardless of what President Trump says, he killed Ayatollah Khamenei, he killed much of the senior leadership. He said that his goal was to bring down the regime, that he was going to be the one who chose the leadership after this. Right? All of this said to the Iranians, this is about regime change, and therefore there is no reason not to close the Strait of Hormuz. And by the way, there is also no reason not to go after all of America's allies all across the Gulf, all across the region. They did all of those things. And what they learned was that far from causing the United States to deliberately bring down the regime, do anything we could to do so, it caused the United States and our allies to back off. Right? In particular, President Trump just wasn't willing to escalate further because of Iran's stranglehold on the Strait of Hormuz and its ability to constantly threaten our Gulf allies. That is the very definition of a deterrence failure. And so coming out of this, unless things change, and this is not over yet, so there's reason to believe it may still, but where we stand right now, we've got to look at this and say that the United States has had a significant deterrence failure. And if we come out of this, there is no reason to believe that this leadership in Iran is going to feel deterred, either from periodically threatening our Gulf allies with drones and ballistic missiles whenever they want to, or from closing the strait or simply attacking ships in the Strait of Hormuz whenever they feel like doing so. That is a signal failure on our part. That is a monumental change from where we were before this war started.
So then let me dig a bit deeper about that word deterrence, right? Deter from what? I'm curious, like in your estimation, how has the U.S. strategy changed over time? Has it changed? What has been the U.S. deterrence strategy? What is it that, let's say, different administrations over time, clearly there's been a strategy of deterrence. what have they been trying to deter Iran from doing? Everybody talks about the nuclear program, but is it as clear as that? And how is it different now? And how has the Trump second administration's deterrence strategy that was pursued until February 28th, one could argue, how is that different? But just let's nail down, what do we mean by deterrence from the US point of view?
Sure. So there were, as you point out, you're absolutely correct. There were multiple aspects of the United States trying to deter Iran, but we should also bring in another word, and that word is coercion. And the U.S. was also trying to coerce Iran. It was a strategy of compellence as well. In terms of deterring, as you pointed out, we were trying to deter Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. We were trying to deter Iran from attacking American allies, both overtly with conventional forces or covertly with insurgencies, terrorism, subversion, the whole panoply of gray zone warfare techniques that the Iranians frequently use. We were trying to deter them from closing the Strait of Hormuz. These were all major elements of American deterrence. And as I said, or as I've already suggested, they worked to a greater or lesser extent. We did, by and large, deter them from acquiring nuclear weapons. We made it clear that if they tried to acquire nuclear weapons, they would pay a very heavy price for doing so, both in terms of the sanctions and also ultimately the threat of American military attack against them. When it came to attacking our allies, we did deter them from using conventional force from doing so. That's certainly something worthwhile. We weren't ever able to convince them, to deter them from employing subterfuge, insurgency, covert action, all the other tools in their toolkit, which they were able to employ both because they're good at them and also because they had plausible deniability, and because the United States was never willing to use conventional military power against them when they did employ those tools. And as I said, with regard to the Strait of Hormuz, that was another deterrence success. We made it very clear to the Iranians that if they did close the Strait of Hormuz, that we would come after them with everything in our arsenal and all of our allies, and probably most of the world in attendance. And that threat, the threat that not only would we reopen the strait by force, but that we would probably bring down the regime by force, that too was enough to deter them. But as I said, we were also trying to coerce them. We were also trying to compel them. We were trying to stop them from doing things. As I said, we were trying very hard to get them to give up Lebanon, give up Iraq, stop trying to subvert other countries. And again, there we had much less success in doing so.
How would you say that the U.S. deterrence objectives have been different from those of Israel?
Well, there's been a lot of similarity. I would say the biggest difference is largely in both the degree to which we've pursued them and the willingness to employ different tools to do so. So, to be very blunt, Israel feels the threat from Iran to a much greater and more immediate degree than the United States does. Iran with a nuclear weapon is an existential threat to the state of Israel. That would be a big problem for the United States. They could certainly do a lot of damage to the United States. It's not literally an existential threat. Ultimately, Iran's support to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to the full range of its proxies and allies surrounding Israel, what Israel refers to as Iran's ring of fire strategy, this too was ultimately an existential threat to Israel. It was more of a distant one. There was no expectation that the Iranians would be able to destroy the Strait of Israel quickly. But nonetheless, it was designed with that in mind. And there were constant attacks on Israel, terrorist attacks, insurgent attacks, ultimately even conventional attacks like Hamas on October 7, 2023. And because of the imminence of this, the fact that Iran was attacking Israel on a regular basis and ultimately was seeking to destroy the state, that made Israel feel the threat much more deeply. It made Israel far more willing to use the full range of tools available to it, in particular, its own incredibly formidable conventional capabilities. But there as well, we should recognize before October 7, 2023, and even to some extent afterwards, Even the Israelis were somewhat restrained. Right? We had what the Israelis used to refer to as the war between the wars, or the campaign between the wars, where they would mount airstrikes against Iranians in Syria in particular. That was a very deliberate bombing campaign, but it wasn't a massive one, and they wouldn't strike Iran directly. Right? They didn't strike Iran directly. Everyone should remember this until Iran first struck Israel directly in April of 2024. Only then did Israel respond against Iran. Until then, the Israelis kept their responses to Iran limited to Iran's proxies and allies in places like, again, Syria and Lebanon, occasionally Iraq, eventually the Houthis as well. But going after Iran directly, that was still off the table for the Israelis until the Iranians attacked Israel first.
So speaking of that, I mean, we could argue that the Iranian regime has also had a strategy of deterrence. I mean, arguably, they did not want to go to war. Certainly, they didn't want to go into a war that they didn't start. They might gladly have started one eventually of their own. So, using that as a premise that they have, in some form or another, had a strategy of deterrence regarding the West, certainly the US and Israel, what went wrong from their point of view that they weren't able to stave this off?
So, first, I'd start by saying that ultimately Iran's grand strategy was an offensive one. It was a strategy of aggression. Iran has been looking to overturn the governments of the Middle East allied with the United States, and basically any that weren't allied with themselves. They were looking to drive the United States out of the region. Theirs was a very aggressive anti-status quo grand strategy. And they employed every form of attack they could to try to, again, overturn regional governments, drive the United States out. But as you point out, there was a deterrent component to it as well. Again, especially when Ayatollah Khamenei was alive before the current war, Ayatollah Khamenei was very wary of the United States. And it goes back to the point that I was making to you just a few minutes ago, which is that Ayatollah Khamenei understood the massive conventional military power of the United States and was always very frightened of taking any action that might cause the United States to use our full power against him. He had seen what the U.S. did to Saddam Hussein in Iraq in both 1991 and again in 2003. And it's always worth remembering, the Iranians lost to Saddam Hussein in 1988. Saddam's army defeated Iran's army. And yes, the Iranians will come up with all kinds of nonsense about how it was really the Americans, but there was an understanding that Saddam had defeated them. And the United States then took apart that army that had defeated them effortlessly during Operation Desert Storm. Right? We then invade Iraq, we invade Afghanistan, obviously in reverse order. And again, we do it with very small forces. We do it very, very easily. That had a huge impact on Ayatollah Khamenei, and it was very clear that he understood that the U.S. could do that to Iran as well, and he did not want to do anything that might trigger such a response from the United States. And so the way that he handled us was a combination of keeping Iran's actions below what he thought were America's red lines, and then deterrence on top of that. And keeping it below America's red lines was trying very hard not to kill too many Americans, at least not when he didn't have plausible deniability, right? Doing some other things that wouldn't not going after the oil in too dramatic a fashion. These were things that he thought might cross an American red line and trigger a big American conventional response. But at the same time, he also was trying a deterrence strategy. The Iranians worked very hard to prepare their own defenses, to make it clear that if the U.S. invaded, we would be fighting all across Iran, in its mountains, in the streets of its cities, in its deserts, everywhere. He built up a missile force of his own that could strike America's allies under the expectation that doing so would cause harm ultimately to the United States. He did build up the capacity to shut down the maritime flow through the Strait of Hormuz, again, believing that if the United States came for the regime, this would cause so much pain to the United States that we would cease and desist. And then finally, he also built up Hezbollah, as a major force that could inflict tremendous pain on Israel. Again, another way that he was hoping to deter American, or in this case, Israeli also, attack on Iran.
Would you say that your own thinking has evolved over time? I mean, from containment to regime change to perhaps something else, given what's been happening since the end of February? Just if you want to just tell me a bit about how your thinking has changed and why.
Sure. So, yeah, I think my thinking has evolved very significantly, especially since the 1990s. In the 1990s, we had Iranian presidents, first Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, and then Mohammad Khatami, both of whom clearly wanted a much better, much different relationship with the United States. Each, in his own way, reached out to the United States to try to see if he could have a better relationship. And in particular, I was President Clinton's director for the Persian Gulf at the NSC at the end of the Clinton administration, when President Clinton kind of saw what Mohammad Khatami was doing. Khatami was the first great reformist president of Iran. He was making it very clear to us in private and even to a certain extent in public that he wanted a rapprochement with the United States. And my feeling was we ought to take advantage of it. Right? Now, the critical piece there was, at the time, none of us really knew what the relative balance of power was between the Iranian president and the Iranian supreme leader. Ali Khamenei was already the supreme leader, but he had been a very weak figure. He was a compromise candidate. He did not have the religious credentials to actually succeed Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic. There was competition. There were plenty of Iranians who were saying that the president had enough power to marginalize Khamenei and bring about this kind of a rapprochement. And President Clinton had this great line that I always liked, which was, he used to say, "This is one where we ought to get caught trying." And I thought that was a reasonable way of thinking about it, that at the very
Yes.
least, we ought to put it to the test, see whether the Iranians could actually have a rapprochement. And so I supported under President Clinton. I will say even later on, I supported the JCPOA. I supported President Obama's efforts to see if he could bring about a rapprochement with another Iranian president, Hassan Rouhani, who again wanted the same thing. And what I think we all learned was that was not possible. That at the
When
end
did
of the
we
day,
learn that? What was the lesson? Is there a moment when you can say, or maybe just a time frame when it became clear that that wasn't working?
sure. So the first most dramatic moment was March 17 of 2000, St. Patrick's Day of 2000. We had Secretary Albright, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, gave a big public address on Iran policy in which she did all kinds of things, including apologize for America's role in the Mossadegh coup, something that the Iranian reformists were saying to us, you got to do this. This will break everything wide open and let us have that rapprochement. And instead, what we found was there was an effort to respond to us, and instead, Ayatollah Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guard shut it down. End of the rapprochement. Khatami was cut off at the knees. And then, of course, it happens again after President Obama signs the JCPOA. There's a period of about 6 months when Secretary of State John Kerry is working, hand in glove with Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif. And it's clear that both Zarif and Kerry are desperate for a rapprochement. And once again, Ayatollah Khamenei makes it clear that is not going to happen. So that's in basically 2015, 2016. And at that moment, my feeling was, okay, we've tried. We've done everything that we could. We've made every effort that we possibly could to have a rapprochement with Iran. They're never going to get a more pro-Iranian president than Barack Obama. I thought Obama went actually way too far in trying to be kind to Iran. I mean, his remark to Jeffrey Goldberg that the Saudis needed to learn to share the Persian Gulf, to share the region with the Iranians, such a horrible statement. But again, it was the best that Iran was ever going to get from an American president. And instead, Khamenei said, absolutely not interested. And of course, while they did keep to the nuclear terms, they then mounted a massive, far more aggressive campaign against the United States and our allies all across the Middle East. That was their response. Not, we want peace, we want a better relationship. It was, we want war, and we're going to go after you however we can do so. And as a result of that, I did come away beginning in about 2015, 2016 with the firm conviction that this regime has no interest in a better relationship with the United States, not under any better terms. Ultimately, regime change has got to be our end state, has got to be our ultimate goal, even if we're not talking about invading Iran. But nonetheless, we have to get to that goal, like as we did with the Soviet Union and containment of the Soviet Union, simply because they have no interest in having anything but an inimical, adversarial, conflictual relationship with us.
And here we are. It is July
Here we are.
2026, a war that we're not quite at the half-year mark, but it was going to get there in a few weeks' time. There's been no regime change. So now what? I know that many people have looked at the possibility of empowering or finding reform-minded people within the regime. They may not even be alive anymore, or as kind of to paraphrase what you said, there may not even be a point, because that's not really going to be the mood in the Iranian leadership right now, and certainly because there's been a war for some months now. So basically, now what? What does regime change look like? How is it going to happen? Because, not to overstate, but arguably the chance was there. Certainly in the immediate beginnings, we all know how the war began and taking out people. And then even after a few weeks had passed, taking out Ali Larijani didn't happen, right? I mean, yes, there's a different supreme leader, Mujtaba, who, whenever he's quoted, I have a mental caveat when they say that he issued a statement, because frankly, nobody's seen him. We haven't seen his face. Nobody's actually heard his voice since he assumed that role. And statements that are attributed to him are at best attributed to him and read aloud on state television. So fine, you could argue there's been regime change because Ali Khamenei, his father, is no longer in power. But whether Mujtaba, I don't want to speculate that he's not even alive, but there's some questions there. So fine, regime change, maybe not. But then I'm curious, what could that look like now? How would that happen? If maximum force perhaps was applied, then that didn't seem to do it. And now what?
So first, let's be clear. The United States did not use all of the military capabilities we could have. I'm not arguing that we should have it. In point of fact, I thought this war was a mistake from the very beginning. I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs almost immediately after the outbreak of war that basically said, well, look, here's some things that you can and should do to make regime change more likely. But the subtext of that whole argument is it is highly unlikely that this is going to work. And I had a number of people who said to me, the first time I read that piece, I thought you were in favor of it. And the second time I read it, I realized you were totally opposed to it. It's like, yeah, exactly. This is not the right way to do it ever. The likelihood it was going to work was always going to be low. Now, as you point out, we don't really know where this is going to end, but it doesn't look like this has advanced the cause of regime change. Right now, it looks like it set it back. The regime is very much in control. It's very much in control of the streets of Tehran and all of Iran's other major cities. There are two ways to think about this. One, as people have pointed out, it's not impossible. You kind of come to an agreement with the Iranians, go back to some kind of a peacetime existence, and hope that at some point in time the Iranian people will rise up, and this time around they'll be successful and overthrow the regime. And we should recognize the Iranian people have been rising up against this regime, every 2 or 3 years going back to 1999. It is clear this regime is quite unpopular. Now, the problem is, of course, the one thing that we do know about successful revolutions is that the only time they succeed is when the regime loses either the capacity or the willingness to use force. That's not been the case in Iran so far, and there doesn't seem to be any indication that that is the case today. Again, this war seems to have hardened the regime. We've got a much harder line leadership, much more willing to use force, which is kind of a major statement, given the fact that the regime killed somewhere between, well, thousands to tens of thousands of people back in December and January, right? So that's really saying something. That is out there. I would put that more in the hope category. Certainly, you wouldn't want to build a strategy on that. The alternative, I think, is to step back, and as a wonderful line from a Rudyard Kipling poem, to stoop and build it back up with broken tools. Right? And I think that's kind of where we are. I think it starts with containment. Again, we've got to get a good ending to this war. Iran cannot be left in control of the Strait of Hormuz. They cannot be left with the sense that they can close it whenever they want or threaten America's allies whenever they want. That's going to require restoring our deterrent, as you've rightly been focusing us on so far. But then I think beyond that, you have to think about how do you bring pressure on this regime from any number of different axes, right? Can you support oppositionists inside the country? Can you employ cyber attacks? Can you employ sanctions in a smarter fashion? Can you aid opposition groups, that is, the Baloch in the southeast, the Kurds in the northwest, the Arabs in the southwest? Can you find ways to create fissures within the regime, encourage different elements within the military to move against the leadership? Right? And the history of American regime change efforts has typically been that when the United States makes a very deliberate effort to bring down the regime, we often can bring down the regime. It typically doesn't work the way that we think it's going to work. And, a former CIA officer who's done a great deal of reading and study of these, it's typically not the group that we back that brings down the government. It's typically some other group that brings down the government. And by the way, that was also true in 1953 in Iran, where, we give ourselves and people give us way too much credit for bringing down Mossadegh. The end of the day, Mossadegh gets brought down by Iranians themselves, in particular Ayatollah Khashoggi. Right? But when you bring this kind of pressure against a deeply unpopular regime, you can cause it to do things that are very detrimental to itself. They'll mount purges. They become deeply suspicious. They'll lash out in all kinds of different ways. And that kind of a process, sustained over time, can destabilize the regime and make it possible for Iranians themselves to bring it down. There's no guarantees that this will work, and it certainly is unlikely to work quickly. But from my perspective, that's the only option that we have left. And as I said, it starts with a very strong containment and deterrent regime, because we cannot allow the Iranians to continue to attack us and our allies across the region with impunity.
So, Ken, I hope you get a full night's sleep generally, but let's say that you think about Iran more than most people I know, even among experts. It's on your mind. What keeps you awake at night? If hypothetically something kept you awake at night about Iran, is there something that just you lie there awake going, I'm really concerned about this? Is there something like that for you?
Yeah, so there are actually three things out there, and unfortunately, this war has made all of them more likely. So the first one is I do worry about an Iranian nuclear weapon, and I think that the evidence is that at least the American and Israeli attacks on Iran in the summer of 2025, Operation Midnight Hammer, Rising Lion, these do seem to have done a lot of damage to Iran's nuclear program, but having spoken to some real experts on the program, people even more steeped in it than myself, there was always a danger that the Iranians would be able to recover the highly enriched uranium, turn that into bomb-grade, weapons-grade fuel, and be able to assemble a crude nuclear device. I always remember, I'm also an expert on Iraq. I just finished a massive book on the history of the U.S. and Iraq. And I always try to remind people that the 1981 Israeli strike on the Osirak reactor in Iraq, right, which at the time everyone believed was a brilliant operation, no question, but at the time everyone believed that it had eliminated Iraq's nuclear weapons program. And what we found out after the Gulf War, and in particular after the invasion of Iraq, was that it hadn't eliminated Iraq's nuclear program, it had massively accelerated it. And in fact, the Iraqis were far closer to having a nuclear weapon in 1990 than they had been in 1981. And had Saddam not been stupid enough to invade Kuwait when he did, we could have been facing a nuclear-armed Iraq in a few years. I worry about that with Iran. That's number one. And as I said, this war has, in my mind, raised that possibility or probability because I worry that this leadership, which let's remember, these are the guys who always opposed the JCPOA. They wanted the nuclear weapon. They didn't want to sign a deal giving it up. And now they've been attacked repeatedly by the US and Israel. I worry that they have a much greater incentive to get it. So that's worry number one. Worry number two is exactly what we saw in terms of the Iranians deciding that they could shut down traffic through the Strait of Hormuz because the US wasn't going to be willing to do what it would take to actually reopen the strait or overthrow this government. And that too has been realized now. That is a very real threat. Again, it's not over yet, but I'm very afraid that when this ends, this leadership in Tehran is going to believe that they can close the strait whenever they want to. And the third one has also been realized, which is that the regime believes that it can attack America's allies with impunity whenever it chooses to do so, and that they will be able to use both that and their threat to the Strait of Hormuz as a protection racket to extract tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars from the Gulf states. And that already seems to be going on. There are all kinds of reports of negotiations between Iran and the different Gulf states because the Gulf states now know that the Iranians can attack them anytime they want with drones, with ballistic missiles. And while, yes, it's true that we've helped them intercept over 90, 96, 98%, the problem is if you're sitting in Dubai and every other day there's a massive explosion overhead because there's a drone or a ballistic missile, or every once in a while one hits the ground, right? That is ruinous to trade, to oil exports, to investment, to tourism, to the dream of the GCC. And so I think it's very clear, until they can defend themselves properly against Iran, they're going to buy the Iranians off. And that's going to mean tens of billions of dollars in the hands of the Revolutionary Guard, and they are not going to use it for good.
Let me close with this as we come upon the end of our half hour together. So, be it in Islamabad, be it in Doha, be it in Bürgenstock, negotiations, wherever they may happen next, let's say they have the wisdom to bring you along with them on the plane, and you get to kind of give advice, your counsel after decades of experience, not just with Iran, but the region and arguably the world. What would you tell the negotiators?
So, I mean, the truth is, what I'd say to them is, please go back, build a time machine, go back to February 27th and don't do this. Right? That's what I'd really like to be able to say. All right, let's set the fantasy aside. What I tell them is hang tough, right? At the end of the day, Iran has a certain amount of leverage, but so do we. And caving to them is literally the worst thing that we could possibly do. Again, we have to recognize, as bad as Ayatollah Khamenei was, and he was monstrous, right? What he did to his own people, to the people of the region, to the people of the United States, absolutely horrendous, unforgivable. This new group is worse, right? Again, these are the hardliners who he used to periodically tell, no, we're not going to go as far as you want. We're only going to go as far as I want, right? This group is worse. And you cannot possibly allow them to come out of this believing that they can blackmail the Gulf and back off the United States whenever they choose to do so. That will be absolutely disastrous for the United States, for our allies in the region, quite frankly, not to exaggerate, but for the entire world, because of the importance of the Strait of Hormuz and Persian Gulf oil still to the international oil market and therefore to the global economy.
That's a brilliant conclusion. On that note, Ken Pollock, thank you. I look forward to having you back on again.
Thanks so much for having me. It'd be my pleasure.